Hi everyone. Are you a board director or a C-suite executive or aspiring to be? Come and listen today as we deep dive into governance and we talk about insights and skills and tips to not only help you survive, but thrive. Let's go. Hello everyone. This Modern Corporate Leader series aims to help boards, C-suite executives and leaders find resilience, purpose and growth, both corporately and personally, through timely insights and clarity. In this series, we'll talk with domain experts, experienced and insightful leaders, both locally and globally, for insights and wisdom, tools and connections to help build successful companies and community. Corporate governance is such an essential, yet typically regular process. So what happens during a severe crisis? Also, typically crisis response plans and business continuity plans may be more acute scenarios, e.g. specific to the company, rather than what we're seeing with global multi-sector crisis at the moment with this current pandemic. So what's the playbook now? I wanted to talk to an expert in corporate governance. So who better than a forensic accountant by training with a wide corporate governance experience of over 30 years. Practicing across listed public company, private ACNC regulated entities through a wide range of industries, including financial services, health sector, higher education, federal and state government, and large charitable sectors. Effective Governance has offices in both Perth and Brisbane, and you can find out more about them at effectivegovernance.com.au. So today, we're fortunate to have the experience of areas of corporate governance, regulatory governance, risk compliance, culture and board dynamics. Please welcome our guest expert, Stephen Howell.
Thanks, Trent. It's great to be with you, and I'm very happy to be involved in this innovative, if you like, process to help your clients and also some of my clients, I suspect, when this gets out there. As you rightly pointed out, I've got a long background history in corporate governance in many fields. I'm the principal advisor for Effective Governance, which in fact is part of the Hopgood Gannon law firm. We're the governance arm of Hopgood Gannon, but we've been operating for about 23 years. My experience, as you mentioned, is in corporate governance and regulatory governance. I do a lot of work around risk. I do a lot of work around compliance and culture and board dynamics. As I sort of jokingly mentioned to you when we were talking at one stage, I often describe myself as being a bit of a governance anthropologist, and I say that because I have to work with boards and senior executives who have all these different behaviours and wants and wishes, and they sort of have particular conduct around or exhibit particular conduct around the various cultures within organisations. And I suppose examples, recent examples that we saw of culture driving behaviour was coming out of the financial services and banks and financial services Royal Commission, where you saw some really bad behaviour, and we now know that was driven by the culture in the organisation. That area of culture that I spend a lot of time working in. I often say when I work with boards and senior executives, and that's who I mainly work with, boards and senior executives, I spend about 95% of my time as a professional working with boards. But I spend about 95% of that 95% in board behavioural dynamics. It's not it's never the lack of experience, skills, competencies from those individuals. It's always about behaviours, and it's always about how you can, how you exhibit your experience and all that wealth of knowledge that you've built up. And I have the same conversation with senior executives, and I think it's really interesting because I think one of the things that sometimes is forgotten is the relationship between senior executives and boards. And one of the things that senior executives, I think, forget is that they have an obligation, if not a duty, to ensure that they're acting appropriately and providing the right information through to the board to make decisions. Now, when I talk about decision making, I talk about it in terms of making defensible decisions, because I think anyone can make a decision. We each and every one of us makes decisions throughout the day. But being in a position to make defensible decisions is the real skill. And that's where the senior executives can help in the organisation. Sometimes when I talk to senior executives, they'll tell me stories about how they don't believe that they're contributing to the organisation because they don't see where the work that they're doing is contributing to the ultimate, or the results in the organisation. But I always say to them, well, let's have a look at that. Let's examine that, because if you've got the right processes, the right procedures, and the right controls in place, and you are providing information that is meeting the expectations of the board, you're contributing significantly, because your contribution as an executive helps the directors and the board overall make those critical decisions. So how do we actually make those decisions? Our decision-making process should always be linked to and driven by strategy and risk. Risk needs to be just embedded into the organisation and embedded into everything that we do. We do that through policy, frameworks, procedures that we have in place. We have people with the right skills that can make that happen. So when we're making decisions, and when we're providing information so the board can make decisions, we need to have factored in those risk areas. It's the same as the information, the type of information, and the quality of the information, and the integrity of the information that you use. Because boards that I deal with will often tell me that they either get too much information, that's normally too much information, and they're unsure as to the quality of that information, the analysis that's gone on behind that information. And there's a couple of ways that I can explain that. The first thing is to say to the board, well, you need to have a level of assurance that the information that is being provided to you is in fact what you need. So the first thing you need to be doing is setting the expectation, because as I say to boards, and I also say to management, if the board doesn't properly articulate its expectations, or clearly articulate its expectations to management, management will second guess you on every occasion. And the reason behind that, of course, is that if management doesn't have any expectations set for it and doesn't really understand what the board wants, it'll second guess, and it'll provide to the board what it thinks the board needs. And then you get a situation where the board will complain, and because then I talk to the board and they say, And I say, well, have you had that conversation? No, we haven't had that conversation. Well, that's a bit tough, to be complaining about the information you get and you actually haven't had that conversation. Now, the same thing can happen with executives, I always say. There's not that communication between executives and board. There should be. It always should happen through the CEO, of course, but when asked the question, you should be able to provide that information. There should be good, clear communication between the board and with management. And so, going back to how do we actually make that happen? How do we actually ensure that management is providing the right information for boards to make those defensible decisions I talk about? Well, the first thing, of course, is that boards need to have the right people with the right skills. So you need to look at the board first and foremost and say, okay, well, against your strategy, looking at your strategy and looking at the strategic imperatives for your organisation, do you have the right skills on that board to be able to drive that strategy and to provide guidance and support to the CEO and the other executives in your team? And the same is the same situation arises with the executive team. And through the CEO should be able to say to his team, or to actually talk to the board and say to the board, well, yes, I have the right team in place. I've got the right executives with the right skills and the right background in their particular field to be able to provide me as the senior executive, as the CEO, with the information that I can provide to you, board members, so that you can actually make those decisions. There are some processes, of course, that we go through. There's the skills analysis. Some really robust skills and competency analysis that you can go through from a board perspective, leading to the production of a skills matrix. Boards that don't have a skills matrix have not really thought about how they're actually going about driving their strategy. Because if the skills matrix doesn't line up with the strategic plan and to be able to drive the strategic imperatives, it's not working. And it's the same within the senior executive team and to his or her senior executives. There are processes that we go through to ensure that the board should ensure that the CEO is set up in such a way as to succeed. We do talk a lot about, don't we? We talk about CEO performance reviews. I don't like to use the term performance reviews because it has a sort of a connotation of that there's the performance is actually not up to speed, so we're reviewing performance. That's not the case. There could be evaluations in place. Evaluation's a better way to do it, and evaluation against KPIs. And so ensuring that the CEO is evaluated against those KPIs, and then that pushes down to the rest of the executives. So any good CEO will ensure that he or she has the right people with the right skills in place. There's, we all know that, generally, there are some exceptions, but generally, boards only have one employee, that is the CEO, and the CEO is delegated the responsibility to run the business on a day-to-day basis. So it would be a very game CEO not to have the right people with the right skills, so that she or he can actually perform to the level of those expectations of the board. I suppose the message that I'm trying to give there is all around decision making, and how do we actually go about ensuring those defensible decisions that I talk about are made. We have, of course, as I mentioned before, the processes and controls that are in place. we have, and there are specific board policies, and there's also management policies. But being able to make clear decisions is the thing to be able to do. I often get asked the question, or sometimes I'll actually pose the question to boards and ask this one question: why do boards exist? I get all sorts of answers as to why boards exist. My simplistic answer is boards exist to make decisions. Of course, boards do a whole bunch of other things, a whole range of other things. But ultimately, what do actually boards do? Boards actually make decisions, don't they? And how do they make those decisions? Well, all the things that we've been talking about. So, that's sort of dumbing it down to an extent, I suppose, by saying that boards only exist to make decisions, because they do, as I said, they do a whole bunch of other things. But that's the most important thing, mate. If you look at some of the classic decisions that have been made by the courts, and some of the more recent decisions that have been made by the courts, they're all very critical of the decision-making process. And it all eventually goes back to the information, or the lack thereof of information, that boards relied upon in making those decisions. So one of the big messages that I'm making in these comments that I'm making now is that there really does need to be that close alignment between board members and the senior executives through the CEO. It needs to be a professional relationship, but there needs to be a close alignment of skills, because if you don't have that, and if the board needs to get to a position of assurance, and I often have that conversation with boards too. How can you at the end of the board meeting, you need to be able to walk away from that board meeting being assured that you have had the right information and you've made those decisions which are defendable. And you need to be feeling very comfortable about processes that have been in place. And if you can get to a situation where you have that level of assurance, you're in a pretty good place. So the other key message I'd like to give is that senior executives should never forget and should always understand they have a key role to play. It's not just pull together a whole bunch of information, hand it over to the board and say, over to you guys. It's about taking responsibility for the delivery of the outcomes and the strategy, and assisting the board members in exercising their functions and exercising their duties.
Yeah, the more value add they can have there, the better. They're very key fundamentals that you're talking about, and they're very applicable in ongoing good governance, and particularly during this crisis that we face at the moment. To me, a lot of that comes down to that transparency. It's about having the right skill set, so you do have transparency across the whole range of what needs to be addressed, and dealing with unknown unknowns as part of that. And then also, it's not just the exhibiting of their experience, it's the team dynamic coming together and that group. And again, we're back to working well together, complementary, critical questioning still, but good communication, and in a timely manner as well. So it's about having that insight of information, the right analysis, so it's distilled in the right ways to get the key points, both good and bad, that need to be addressed, but in a timely manner as well. And I think that executive suite bringing that to the board, and the board having been very clear what they need and why and how, and having made the decisions to set the guidance for the overall corporate entity, but then being clear on what needs to come back for them to manage that. It's very, communication and the timeliness of that, I think, is really critical, particularly in these tight moments.
Culture plays such a big part of that, Trent. Such a big part. The old cliche about culture will eat strategy for breakfast, every day of the week. It is true in a sense. I mean, you've still got to have a very robust strategy. Any organisation has to, otherwise they won't survive. And you need to stick with that strategy. And strategy needs to drive your decision making. But if you don't have the right culture and you don't have people behaving appropriately within that culture, it's not going to work. And of course, having the right culture is a good way to ensure that you do in fact have the right people. Because if there are people that within the organisation that their own values don't align with the organisational values or culture, they will self-deselect and they'll go, and that's a good thing. You only want people in your organisation that have the right values, and those values are aligned with your organisation. And we all know that the values and culture need to be driven from the board. But management, of course, has a responsibility then to push that down through the rest of the organisation. And as we saw in the Hayne Royal Commission, the bad culture was what was driving the behaviour, as I mentioned earlier. Was driving the behaviour of those individuals. I'm absolutely positive that some of those people would not have behaved the way they did unless it was driven by that culture. And we talk a lot about the shadow culture, the stuff that happens outside of culture that we don't actually see. And I often pose the question, who's actually, what are people doing? What are people doing in your organisation when nobody's watching? The answer should be they're all behaving themselves and they're all doing exactly what we expect them to do, and they're all contributing to the organisation's values and goals. That should be the answer. But so many times I get answers, well, I don't really know. Maybe we should be watching a bit more closely. And if you're in that situation, well, something's amiss. So I and my colleagues do a lot of work around what we call culture and conduct risk. I strongly believe that when we talk about culture not working, and we talk about conduct, dysfunctional conduct within organisations, and it could be within the board as well, it is in fact a risk, and it should be categorised as a risk. And so that's why we call it culture and conduct risk. And there's a process that we go through, right, starting from the board down through the senior executives, and then into the next level of management, and getting right down into the business. And when you actually get down in the lower levels of the business and you start asking questions about, what's the values set of your managers, and what messages are you getting from your managers, or what messages board or from the CEO, you get some answers, and you can understand why people sometimes behave that way. So there are some processes that you can use to make sure that you get the information and data that you need to fix some of those issues. And so, as I said, ensuring that people are behaving appropriately in line with the culture, having the right values, is just absolutely critical in any organisation.
And again, that reporting and transparency back up to the board or to the C-suite and the board, and having the right KPIs, not only to measure it, but also to ensure there is alignment with what the purpose and the strategy is so critical as well. And I do a lot around coaching, consulting with exponential companies, and one of our key exponential attributes really in helping them is an MTP, a massive transformative purpose, which is really, looking at that mission to vision, but then going above that and how is it changing the world. And if you have that real driver. It becomes that magnet for the right people, and like you're talking about the culture, it becomes that foundation stone for all your people, your culture, and magnetizes the right people and keeps them aligned, so that when there are these issues or gaps or problems, they can all be aligned and shoulder to shoulder still in the right direction. It helps pull them back to what that key purpose is overall as well. And if that's not, set in the culture and rippled all the way down from the board down, then it just opens up to these gaps and misalignment as it goes forward.
I think it's really interesting, Trent, isn't it? That in the current environment, you asked me earlier about how are people behaving, or what am I seeing in this COVID-19 environment? And I think it's fascinating. I think it's absolutely fascinating, because one of the things that I do see is that overall, I think people are being valued above profit, which I think is a really interesting thing. I mean, that always should be the case. Organisations should always value their people, shouldn't they? Because but sometimes they forget, don't they? Sometimes they actually forget the value in the people that drive and run their business. And it's only in times like this, it's in times of crisis, that organisations understand, well, hang on, all these people are such hard working. They're prepared to, go that extra yard. They're prepared to really put some significant work in for us. They're not really, they're working remotely. They're working from home. They're setting up processes to ensure that the business continues to run. They're helping us to run the business. They're concerned about the business, generally concerned about the business, they're not just concerned because it's, they're trying to maintain their job. It's about a genuine concern about ensuring that the business is sustainable and survives, and they'll go out of their way to make that happen. So what we're seeing is organisations, boards and senior executives understanding how valuable those people are, and people are valued above profit, because the boards and senior executives, organisations are smart enough to know that by doing what we're doing at the moment, it's only going to increase when we come out the other end, because people are going to really appreciate what's happened. They're going to really appreciate the way that the organisation has stuck by them. They're going to really appreciate the way that their individual skills were valued, and it's going to be of significant benefit to the organisation when you come out at the other end. So there is a bit of a win-win there. But I just think it's really interesting that we're seeing this value in people.
Yeah,
and I see it, Trent, in just about every organisation that I'm currently working with.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because it's during these challenges or crises that you do see those leaders step up, and those that come and really are really there for the right reason come through. And it's great to see the corporations moving from just a shareholder, possibly to a stakeholder or a CSR program, to now really realising these are our people, our employees in our company that make what we need happen. We need to look after them. And then this is our community that we operate in. And they're not just locally as well, but, that global community and the sensitivities to the global marketplace, whether it's supply chain or financially, et cetera, I think it's really highlighting some of that. And that exposure and issues are really helping us refocus on what's important. And so I think it's a great, there'll be some really good opportunities, and we're seeing some good behavior come through this. And I think the market the employees will see that, the market will see that. And I think we'll see some of these companies grow that are doing the right things. And that includes companies that then, maybe have pivoted in the short term, or it might be a longer term play for them as well. Can you maybe talk about, this is a stressful period for the people, but the companies as well. You brought up about the banks before. And I think the grounding of our usual, prior to this crisis, our governance and frameworks and processes, good grounding in that is so important normally, but even more important now. What are your comments around the stress tests that we saw and lessons that came out of maybe some of the banking issues, and I guess our preparation up until 2 months ago, 3 months ago, that you now see playing out well now, or still being an issue?
Yeah. I really do. I really do see some good examples of. I see good and bad examples. I see the good examples are where organisations have been diligent. I see lots of organisations that are being very diligent in their processes of looking at their crisis management plans, looking at continuity plans, and how businesses are going to survive in their own in environments like this, where there's huge crises, and they actually really do need to enlist the help of people within the organisation that can actually lift their game to an extent. So I see where organisations have committed to stress testing, where there's been financial stress testing, where there's been other than financial stress testing done, where there's been scenario planning done for crises like this. We hear there's been a bit of talk about black swan type events. I don't think this is a black swan event, but there's been talk about that sort of stuff. And I think that we've been through corporate Australia has been through a number of crises over the years. We had the GFC, but we've also had floods and fires and also all sorts of disruption that organisations have had to have dealt with. Those organisations that actually are serious about risk. And when I talk about risk, I always like to talk about risk in terms of it being positive. There's a lot of talk around risk, and risk is spoken about in terms of it being a negative. It should never be a negative. It should always be a positive. And it should always be a positive because if you've actually gone through the process of having a good risk framework in place and having good risk policies in place, if you've gone through that process and you've got good risk frameworks, policies in place, and you have, as I said, importantly, the right people with the right background and skills in risk to drive that policy and make sure the framework works, you're in a much better position. I can see some organisations that are not going to survive. I can see some businesses that aren't going to survive under a new model because they actually haven't gone through the process. They didn't think this was ever going to happen. It was always going to happen to somebody else. But they're now realising that they actually didn't have the processes in place to help. The organisations that I see that are surviving are the ones that not just have an organisational crisis management plan in place, but have a board crisis management in place. I mean, crises happen, regularly, don't they? At small levels. Crises are confronted. Organisations are confronted by crises, at various levels on an annual basis. And they're dealt with. And they probably don't get much publicity, but they're dealt with at that local level. It's these huge crises like we're going through now are the ones that test us out. And if you had an organisational crisis plan and tried to utilise your organisational crisis plan to get you through COVID-19, you'd be in trouble. Having a board crisis management plan driven by, key people within the board, people that understand how to communicate, how to make decisions, how to make the right decisions, how to talk to the right people within the organisation, and how to utilise all their networks and all the support and advisors that they need, they're the ones that are going to survive.
Yeah, I think, risk and opportunity, and in this case, maybe crisis and opportunity, are interlinked. It's not, to me, typically about just risk elimination totally. That normally can't happen, but it's about that management, the identification, the mitigation, so that you can still bring in opportunity as you move forward as well.
Yeah.
I love the book Antifragile, because it talks about, it's not. I love resilience, okay, and a lot around that, but resilience doesn't really cover it, and robust doesn't cover it. Something's fragile and it breaks easily, but if you stress it and work it and it's anti-fragile, then it builds from that, it becomes stronger from that. So, that's where these stress testing and having gone through crises before and have processes and frameworks and be shaken down as a team to now wade through this is really important. Or I see that's where you really see some companies excel and boards really move forward strongly. Yeah. What if some of those boards are struggling now? Is it too late? And what are some of the key things that they should be looking at or addressing, in this short to medium term, let's say?
I don't necessarily think it's too late. It's never too late to actually sort of to really try and fix these, try and fix a situation in respect to developing good processes and putting good structures in place. We all know that structure follows strategy, and you've got to have that good structure, strategy in place to ensure that you can structure your business to drive the strategy. So I think that's one of the things that these organisations that are struggling at the moment should be doing. They should be looking very, very at their current strategy. Do they have the right strategy? Probably not, because it needs to change. We all know that we can change our strategy because of events. Here's a good example. Here's a great example of an event that's come along that's required us to change our strategy, because what strategy we had in place, a couple of months ago to drive our business is completely and absolutely different from what the strategy is today. So if you're still working on your old strategy, good luck. So what boards can do, and it's not difficult, but you need some assistance. You need assistance to do it. You need to go through a process and say, okay, well, this is where we are now, and this is what we've got. These are the resources that we've got. These are the people that we've got. This is the business model that we currently have. How do we need to change that, or what changes do we need to make to ensure that we can continue to operate a sustainable business, albeit under a different model? But you actually need to go through that process, because if you just leave it the way it is, it's not going to work. So that's the recommendation that I would make, is to seriously and very quickly look at your current strategy and work out where you actually want to be, because where you want to be in this current environment is completely different than what you thought you were going to be. And you're going to have different resources available to you, and you're going to have different drivers, and your whole business model may have changed because you've been forced to change. But that's okay, because I, like you, I hear you, Trent, talking very positively about some good outcomes coming out of this, and I'm with you. I think there's going to be some really solid, good outcomes out of this whole COVID-19 situation, and there's going to be changes the way that we go about doing things. There's going to be changes about the way that people operate on a day-to-day basis. But I think all that change is going to be for a better environment and a better working environment. I think we You know, I'm probably a little bit critical, Trent, because I do struggle a bit with this what I call this world of entitlement that we live in. You know, there's been this. I can see over the years, you know, that people have grown up in this world of entitlement, where they think that you know, they're entitled to just about everything. And I think this has been a bit of a wake-up call, because I'm now seeing those people and those organisations that thought it was an entitlement to have what they had, and to be working the way that they had, and to be delivering their products the way that they had, and to be communicating with their customers the way that they had, is now very different. And so I think it's a wake-up call. But if you see it the right way, if you see it in a positive way, if you take all that on board and say, okay, well, yeah, maybe we weren't interacting with our customers in an appropriate way. Maybe we weren't treating our people the way that we should have been. Maybe we weren't producing the quality product that we perhaps should have been. If that's the outcome that comes out of this, that is a great thing. And I think, you know, and we're seeing examples of, you know, new businesses growing up and changes in businesses overnight. Who would have thought that wineries and gin producers would have been making hand sanitizers?
Yeah. And that's just the start of it. Yeah, there'll be a lot more of that as well. So, you know, a lot of my coaching work and consulting work is around innovation, disruption, and looking at core streams where the business is looking at innovation internally, and how can they see disruptions out there and then react to it, which is very much what we're seeing here. It's a disruption across multiple sectors and segments all at the same time, not just one piece of technology, emerging technology coming at them, for example. And then also we're seeing, you know, we tend to look at edge initiatives where it's looking at, well, what are those real problems and solutions for that, being able to utilize new technologies or disruptive business models and helping them take through that process. So very much looking at how does a company internally deal with this, or how do we really pivot or stand up something new on the edge that's a new disruptive business model from this? What's the opportunity to leverage our assets or our IP and move forward? And that's the opportunity now for companies, where they can't just dust off the business continuity plan and go, great, I just need to adjust this and we'll run lean for a while. No, the whole world has changed. This is not business as usual. You now need to look, right, okay, let's get up on the top of the mast, take a view of what's really happening, and then pick where we're going to sail on this and reset ourselves and move forward. So, yeah, and a lot of what I do is that future scenario modeling. So then you can go, well, if these are all the different scenarios, we don't know what's going to happen. But if it's any of these ones, then we've set ourselves for that, so we can deal with that on some, you know, defendable basis, and we'll move forward on that. And that's better than just going on with your head in the sand with what you think's happening. And even although there's short firefighting that needs to happen, at least you can make those decisions that are tactical decisions based on where you think your strategy is going, rather than cutting your nose off to spite your face to make very short-term decisions as well.
Exactly, yeah.
But again, this takes a board that is well structured, can sit back, has got the information flow from the C-suite to have transparency, and then can make those decisions and then convey it back down through the group. And again, communication is so important, not just for what needs to be done, but that emotional support for the company, the teams, the employees, because, you know, during these times of uncertainty, that's when those people are most sensitive. And, you know, we've got a lot of emotional stress that we yet to see, I think, play out in the communities as well as this unwinds. So the better, you know, the leaders, the boards, the C-suite, you know, the management can convey that and support that and address the elephant in the room, you know, the better for everybody.
Yeah, we can no longer say, you know, like we've heard so many times. Oh yeah, we tried that a couple of years ago and didn't work. So we're not going to do that again. Well, you know what I'm saying now is, well, you know, what we were trying a month ago didn't work. So, don't tell me about what happened a couple of years ago. We've moved on significantly from there. And the whole, as you rightly point out, the whole world's changed. The whole framework has changed. The way we go about interacting and the way we go about conducting our business has changed. So it's just it's quite amazing. Someone was saying to me this morning, one of my colleagues was saying to me this morning, we're just about to, well, I'm not sure about, we're going to be able to get back into the office, because I made a comment that we're going to get back in the office by the end of May, which is my hope, because I've put my hand up and said, I want to be the first. And they said, we're just about to launch into a horrible new flu season. And I said, well, hang on, let's just think about that for a second. We've managed to put to bed, a world pandemic, and we've done that through physical distancing and a whole bunch of strategies to ensure that we actually don't transmit. Why can't we do that same thing with the flu? Why do we actually have to just say, no, we're just about to launch into a big flu season, so there, what examples that we've used to get over this COVID-19 situation. If we use that to help us with the flu season, surely that's got to be of immense value. And what that's going to do, the reason that I raise that is because that's going to also help us with our workflow planning, with our whole strategy to ensure that our people get back to work and our people are safe. If we just forget about what we've done with COVID and don't employ that to continue, yeah, sure, people are going to get sick through the flu season and that sort of stuff. But why don't we just leverage from that? Why don't we take that example and say, well, we don't necessarily need to have the same level of physical distancing necessarily, but we can use some of the techniques that we've discovered to help us through this new environment. And if that's going to ensure organisational sustainability, if that's going to ensure that our people are safe and well and productive, the big advantage of ensuring that we continue with the practices that we've discovered through COVID is going to ensure that we continue to have productive people. It's continue to have safe people and create an environment that's going to ensure that we have sustainable workforce.
And I think coming out of this, as well as we start coming back into working together, and I wouldn't say business as usual, but again, that communication by the leaders to the people and of that path and supporting them, and what's acceptable and not, and what the expectations are, will be really important. And I also love that through this process, in a way, it's forced the implementation of technologies and different working styles. It's forced people outside of the box. And yes, there's been a loss of productivity. Yes, we've had to learn new skills and it's been uncomfortable. But there's been so much learnings that come from that we can now bring back and implement in the way we move forward, or at least there's the opportunity to do that. And it's not been just about efficient business as usual and optimizing our production and efficiency for a corporate as we normally do. It's opened up the Pandora's box of different things we could do, or ways we could work, or different relationships. But again, it's about risk management to that for me, where it's, as we look at different opportunities, that whether they're customer driven or technology driven, it's how do you test it and take little bite-sized pieces off. So you're failing fast, but they're small failures. They're not big failures. Let's go and test a little thing. If it works, great. We'll implement that. And if it doesn't, it's not going to shut everything down. Whereas at the moment, so many are burning platforms. We need to make changes anyway. Right, let's try that. That doesn't work, but this is okay and this is okay. Now we'll go and refine it, but let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. So I think, again, there's a lot of opportunities to learn from what we've done and make things better, or head down new tracks as well. With ways of working and risk management and cultures. before we leave that to, coming back to that sort of typical model that I see in normal, with the board at one level and the executives at the other, and very formal reporting, let's say, between the two, maybe, could you comment on that integration between the two, whether it's through the crisis response team or just simply, how we're seeing cadence increase and dialogue with the directors with the executives increase? Have you got any comment there?
Yeah. I think, Trent, what I've seen is a greater understanding between of board members with the abilities or lack of abilities in some of their executives. What I'm seeing, and I'm going to board meetings, with my clients. I'm going to board meetings just about on a day-to-day basis because I'm, doing particular jobs for different clients. And I go to board meetings, or I'm interacting in other meetings, in committee meetings, or I'm just having staff being invited along to staffing meetings for particular purposes. And what I'm seeing is that, particularly the chairs that I directly deal with, they'll come back and talk to me about the level of expertise that they see in particular executives that they've not seen before. So, and I'm saying, well, isn't that great? Isn't that a positive? Now, don't lose that. Don't lose that. You need to make sure that continues. So, if that's something that you see as a positive, make sure that continues. They're also saying to me, I didn't realise that a particular executive or a particular manager in the business didn't have the necessary level of skill that we always thought that person had. Now, there's a couple of ways that we can deal with that. We can say, okay, well, let's look at the individual. Do we value that person? Does the person do a reasonable job? If they're not up to that level that you thought they were, because you're now seeing it more vividly, we can provide some professional development for them. So it's not about identifying somebody and flicking them. It's about, let's try and work a program to keep that person but to upskill them. But I'm finding it really interesting that that boards are really getting a different vision, a completely different vision and understanding in this sort of an environment. So that's a real positive to me, and something that we need to think about. We need to think about how we can actually keep that going and how that can continue. I mean, I've always been very big on communication and communication between boards and senior executives within a proper protocol and in a professional way, of course, times. But where there's not that good level of communication and interaction, that's where things go wrong. The other thing that I'm seeing, Trent, interesting enough, if you turn it around the other way, I'm also hearing from senior executives who are saying to me, I didn't realise how busy our chairman was. I didn't realise how busy, the chairman of the Audit and Finance Committee was. I didn't realise the amount of work that they put into that. I didn't realise the level of expertise of those people, because the interaction is much more intimate than it has been, and it's more often. I've got some boards that are now operating fortnightly, having fortnightly meetings. I've got committees that some committees are meeting weekly. So there's much more interaction between executives and boards, and so it's really interesting that those people are seeing a different side of the individual, which is really, in my view, that's a really positive thing. There's also been some classic examples of where boards have identified where some executives have been hiding, if you like, and really didn't understand the lack of experience and skill that these people, that some people had, which is sad, but but it's also positive because it's been identified, so they can deal with that. I think the other thing for me, going back to the boards, is that I have also seen in some of the boards that I'm working with, those directors who are the genuine hard workers and those who aren't. And you see it. It's much more obvious. I just find the whole thing interesting. I go back to my my governance anthropology sort of statement. I just get really interested in people's behaviours and how they react or how they don't react, and so it's and of course I always look at it in terms of how are they contributing to the organisation, because that's what it's all about.
We've gone through some great matters, and I'd love to deep dive a little bit further on. But for today, to wrap up, what are there any particular key takeaways or actions that you would put forward to the chair, the MD, and or the CEO, to address or consider in this immediate period?
Key takeaways for me are that relationship and communication between chair, CEO, board, and senior executives. Having the right people with the right skills, the communication is just critical, absolutely critical. and the great boards that I work with, always comprise of high performing chairs equals a high performing board equals a high performing organisation. And there's no question about that. And I can show you many examples. If you've got a really high performing chairman or chair, they, from the very nature of the way that they operate, will insist upon a high performing board, and will go out of their way to make sure they've got a high performing board in place. And a high performing board will insist that they have a high performing CEO, and that'll push down through the rest of the organisation. So the whole issue of high performance, and it all goes back to background and experience and talent, but it's all about communication as well. Because unless there's that communication between chair, CEO, and board members, and then back down through the organisation, it's not going to work. The other key takeaway for me is watch that culture issue. Really concentrate on the culture. We spoke a lot about strategy. Yeah, sure, we need to have strategy in place, but culture is so important. So, my advice to boards is to really watch your communication, make sure that you're actually communicating effectively with your senior executives, and make sure you have of the culture in the organisation. And of course, as you pointed out a while ago, that reporting back to the board, having the senior executive reporting back to the board on not just the implementation of strategy, but implementation of culture. How is all that working? So that the board understands all that. Thanks, Trent.
No, thanks very much, Stephen. I really appreciate your time and sharing your insights and wealth of wisdom with us today. It's been wonderful. So if anybody has any questions or queries or thoughts, please reach out to Stephen at effectivegovernance.com.au or myself. Love to hear from you with any comments, queries, or suggestions for what we're doing through this series as well. Thanks very much again, Stephen. Go well.
Thank you, Trent. It's been a pleasure.
Cheers, everyone.